Today we're talking about boundaries. This topic comes up so often. Why? Because when we try to set boundaries and enforce them, a lot of times our children have a really hard time with it. They push back, sometimes they melt down, they're screaming, sometimes on both sides. And it's exhausting. And sometimes it makes you wonder, should I just give in this time? But here's the thing, boundaries aren't just about rules. They're about safety. They're about defining the world so that our children can process it. And when they don't have them, they don't feel safe. So even when boundaries lead to meltdowns or to pushback, they're what help kids feel safe and anchored in a world that can otherwise feel very unpredictable. I found this analogy helpful in thinking about boundaries. Imagine you're driving on a windy, twisty mountain road and there are no guardrails. You would feel a lot more tense, nervous, anxious because you can't even see the edge necessarily. When there are guardrails, it still might feel a little scary, but you can see the edge. It feels more safe and secure, like something is keeping you from going over the edge. That's what boundaries do for our children. Our kids push those boundaries to see if they're steady. If you move them every time there's a meltdown, then they learn that boundaries aren't real. So they keep testing them, and the power struggles get worse. But when you hold firm, they internalize. Mom or dad, they mean what they say, and I don't have to be in charge because they've got this. Let's talk for a second about what boundaries are and what they're not. So a lot of parenting advice, of course, says set clear boundaries. But here's a nuance that I want you to consider. You can't actually enforce boundaries on things that you don't control. And when you try, things turn into a power struggle. So you need to set boundaries in a way that you can enforce them. Enforcement doesn't have to be harsh or punitive. In the same way that we want to support our children to meet any goal, we can support them to meet that boundary. So let's dig into some examples. You can't make your child fall asleep at 8 p.m. You don't control their bodies, but you can set a limit that says bedtime is at 8 o'clock. You don't have to sleep, but you have to be in bed with the lights out at that time. In another example, you can't force your child to eat 3 bites of broccoli. That it's their body. You don't control it, nor should you try. It's their body autonomy. But you can set limits in certain ways, such as you can say, you don't have to eat everything, but you can choose from what's here. That frames it as a choice without implying a power struggle. A common issue that parents often face around food issues is that the child doesn't want to eat meals and then wants snacks. So you could set a boundary that says either something like, you don't have to eat dinner, but the kitchen is closed. Don't love that one because if your child's hungry, they might need food. But you can say, if you're not hungry for this dinner food right now, that I understand that, but if you ask for food later, you're going to eat this dinner food, right? That's it, placing the boundary on you have to eat food, not snacks, but you can give them the choice about what time that happens. It also communicates to them that if you think you're holding out for snacks, think again. Hitting is another example of a complicated boundary because you can't keep your child from actually hitting someone. And even if you try, they usually lash out. But here's a way you could set boundaries around hitting. You could say something like, if you hit, I'm going to need to move further away or help you step back because I can't let anyone get hurt. This teaches that hitting leads to a change in proximity and reinforces safety in the moment. You could say something like, another example would be, if you hit during play, we have to take a break until you're ready to play safely. This frames it as a pause, not a punishment, and reinforcing that play happens when it's safe for everyone. For an older child, where it's more complicated because it's harder to separate yourself, they're bigger, they're stronger, you might say something like, I won't let anyone get hurt. If you're feeling that upset, we need to take space until you can be around others safely. This emphasizes a safety first message. If a child lashes out during a conversation, you can say, I can see you're overwhelmed right now. We need to pause this conversation because I won't allow hitting. So let me know when you're ready to work through this safely. Another example would be, if you're not able to keep your hands to yourself, we'll need to change how we're interacting right now. Let's figure out what will help. This allows for problem solving instead of a top-down consequence. When you try to control something you can't, your child feels the need to push back because they literally have the control over that thing. But when you hold firm to what you can control, they learn to regulate themselves within those limits. I know that this idea that children need and want boundaries is a little confusing because when we're setting them and enforcing them, it sure doesn't feel like gratitude. They're not saying, "Wow, Mom, thanks so much for keeping me safe." Instead, you get yelling, tears, arguing, meltdowns. That's because while kids really need boundaries, they also want what they want. Both things are true at the same time. Their emotional brain is focused on the immediate frustration of not getting what they want, even if their larger sense of security is being reinforced. A lot of parents have a difficult time with validating the feelings at that moment because they worry that it somehow undermines the boundary or it feels like they're backtracking. But validating a feeling doesn't mean we regret the decision. It just means we understand that it's hard. For example, you could say, "I know you really wanted more screen time. It's frustrating when it's time to turn it off." That doesn't mean that you're giving in. It just means that we get why they're upset. The key is both and. We hold the boundary and we support their feelings. They can be upset and we can stay steady. And when we do that over time, they learn that big feelings aren't a problem and neither are boundaries. Here's a great example of how setting boundaries can help reduce chaos. In the example of sibling fighting, which does come up a lot, oftentimes the argument isn't really about the toy or the turn. It's about fairness, control, and unpredictability. When boundaries are inconsistent, kids don't know what to expect. And when they don't know what to expect, they fight harder for control. Here's a real-life example. On some days, Liam, who is 9, was fine with his sister Emma, who is 7, playing with his Legos. On other days, he wasn't fine and wouldn't let her touch them. Mom's response varied. Sometimes she made Liam share, and sometimes she didn't. The result was constant fighting. Emma felt cheated when she wasn't allowed to play, and Liam felt anxious because he never knew if his choice would be respected. So here's how Sarah fixed it, Sarah being Mom. She set clear, predictable rules. Special toys, like Liam's Legos, didn't have to be shared. Family toys, like board games, for example, were for everyone. And personal items that are shared are subject to permission of the owner. If the owner says no, then the answer is no. Over time, the fights subsided, Liam felt secure knowing his boundary would be respected, and Emma stopped arguing because she knew the rule wouldn't change based on the moment. So this is a great example of how kids don't just need boundaries for behavior, they need them for relationships too. Predictability reduces sibling fights because it removes the power struggle over fairness. Right now, I know it feels like giving in keeps the peace. And frankly, sometimes if we set the boundary in the wrong place, there is some collaboration where the boundary might be moved. But let's set that aside for a second, because that's a complicating factor. When we show our children that their behaviors get us to move the boundaries, all we're doing is really helping them know that if they do more of that, they'll get more of what they want. And that's not the message we want to send. When our children have meltdowns over boundaries, it doesn't mean the boundary is wrong. It just means that your child is learning that the rule is real. Sometimes I want you to know that it gets a little worse before it gets better. Because when kids find out that their go-to strategy, whether it's whining or shouting or crying, when they find out that doesn't work, they push harder. They try more of it. But if you stay steady, they learn that you mean what you say. And the underlying message of that is that they don't have to be in charge and that they can handle frustration. So here's a way that I would advise you to start putting this into place. Pick one boundary. Don't try to do it with everything all at once. It's too much. Just choose one boundary to hold firm. Maybe it's keeping a bedtime routine or something related to screen time. One mom used it to restrict how many times a week her son could have candy. He could only have candy on Saturdays, and she was shocked at how quickly he adapted to the new rule. When she was ready to stay steady and validate his feelings of disappointment at first. And once your child sees that you mean what you say in one area, you'll start feeling more confident in holding other boundaries too. So this is why boundaries make kids feel safe, not restricted. Yes, they're restricted in the moment, but overall, they crave that safety. Predictability reduces power struggles, especially between siblings, as we talked about. So holding firm now prevents bigger challenges later. If this resonated with you, I'd love if you'd drop a comment below, and if you'd consider giving a like to the video. What's one boundary you're working on holding firm? Let's support each other on this journey. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.